Why did you come back? To tell me why you ran out on me at the railway station?
If you only knew the truth.
I wouldn't believe you no matter what you told me. Garden with champagne before you let the Germans drink it.
This sort of takes the sting out of being occupied.
There's a man arrived in Casablanca on his way to America. Victor Laszlo.
Laszlo?
You know those perfect storms in Hollywood where everything just works?
You are our last hope. If you don't help us, Victor Laszlo will die.
Well, buckle up, because I'm about to tell you about the most perfect accident in film history, Casablanca. Released in 1942, smack in the middle of World War II, nobody, and I mean nobody, thought this movie would be anything special. Warner Brothers just saw it as another wartime picture to cash in on the headlines. They were cranking out patriotic films left and right, and Casablanca was supposed to be just another one for the pile. Here's something wild. The studio rushed this thing into production so fast that when they started filming, the script wasn't even finished. They were literally handing actors pages on the day of shooting. And get this, the whole thing was shot for around $878,000, which was pretty standard for Warner Brothers at the time. These days, that's about $15 million when you adjust for inflation. Basically, lunch money by modern Hollywood standards. But here's where it gets interesting. When Casablanca first hit theaters in late 1942, the reviews were, well, let's say politely mixed. The New York Times called it pretty good entertainment. Talk about faint praise. The movie did fine at the box office, nothing spectacular. It made its money back, and then some, but it wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. What's fascinating is that the timing of the release couldn't have been more perfect, even though nobody planned it that way. The movie premiered in New York just weeks after the Allies had actually invaded North Africa. Suddenly, this fictional story about refugees and resistance in Morocco was playing while real American troops were landing there. You couldn't buy that kind of publicity if you tried. The real magic happened when regular people started watching it. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. This wasn't just another propaganda film. This was something special, something real. By the time the Academy Awards rolled around in 1944, Casablanca snagged 8 nominations and took home 3 big ones: Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Adapted Screenplay. Not bad for a movie that everyone thought would be forgotten by Christmas, right? But trust me, we're just getting started, because the story of how this regular Warner Brothers picture became maybe the greatest film ever made, that's where things get really interesting. If you're loving these technical details about Casablanca, hit that like button. Next up, we'll meet the incredible cast that brought this masterpiece to life. Stay tuned. Let's talk about why Casablanca looks so darn good, even after 80+ years. The whole movie was shot on Warner Bros. Sound stages, and they turned that limitation into pure magic. The film's cinematographer, Arthur Edison, was already a legend. He'd shot Frankenstein and The Maltese Falcon, but what he did with Casablanca was next level. Ever notice how the shadows in Rick's Cafe tell their own story? That wasn't just style. It was clever problem solving. They couldn't afford fancy sets, so Edison used shadows and lighting to create depth and mystery. Those ceiling shots in the cafe, nobody was doing that back then. They had to cut holes in the soundstage roof to make those shots work, but man, was it worth it. The way they filmed Ingrid Bergman is practically a masterclass in itself. Edison always lit her from her best side and used gauze filters to give her that ethereal glow. Fun fact, they even tilted the camera slightly up when filming her close-ups to make her look more angelic. It became a technique that countless films copied afterward. The film's sound design was revolutionary for its time. The way they layered the noise of the cafe, the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses, created this incredibly immersive atmosphere. They actually recorded different language conversations separately and mixed them together to create that authentic international feel. The famous Paris flashback sequence? That was shot using a special technique with rain and mist to create a dreamy, romantic quality. They used a combination of fine water spray and backlighting to achieve that nostalgic glow that makes those scenes feel like memories rather than just flashbacks. The set design might look simple, but it's incredibly clever. Rick's Cafe feels lived in and real because they packed it with details. All those extras in the background? Most were actual European refugees who'd fled to Hollywood, speaking their native languages in the background scenes. That's not something you could fake. The costume design deserves special mention, too. Notice how Rick's white dinner jacket stands out in every scene? That was intentional. They wanted him to be the focal point, even in crowded shots. Meanwhile, Ilsa's wardrobe gets progressively darker as the film goes on, reflecting the growing complexity of her situation. The famous fog in the finale wasn't just for drama, it was hiding the fact that the airport was basically a plywood set with a small cardboard plane. The whole scene was shot on a soundstage, and that mysterious fog was created with mineral oil sprayed into the air. The plane in the background? It was actually a small wooden model, and those guys working around it were midgets, making the model look bigger than it was. And here's something cool. All those intense close-ups of Bogart and Bergman weren't just artistic choices. The film was made during wartime rationing, when film stock was limited. Close-ups used less film than wide shots, so they had to get creative with how they told the story. Those intimate shots between Rick and Ilsa? They're partly there because they had to save film. Every technical choice in Casablanca came from a mix of necessity and innovation. They didn't have a huge budget or fancy equipment, but what they did have was creativity and craftsmanship. And somehow, all those limitations helped create a visual style that still influences filmmakers today. Let's talk about the cast that made magic happen. Humphrey Bogart as Rick? He wasn't even the first choice, or the second, or third. The studio wanted Ronald Reagan. Yeah, that Ronald Reagan, or George Raft. But Bogart stepped in and completely reinvented himself. Before Casablanca, he was mostly playing gangsters and tough guys. This was his first romantic lead, and he knocked it out of the park. Ingrid Bergman as Ilsa was absolute perfection. But here's the thing. She was actually kinda miserable during filming. Why? Because she had no idea how the movie would end. Remember that unfinished script I mentioned? Bergman kept asking the directors whether Ilsa would end up with Rick or Victor, and they honestly didn't know. So she played every scene with both possibilities in mind, which accidentally created that perfect sense of uncertainty her character needed. The way Bogart played Rick was revolutionary for its time. Instead of the typical macho hero, he created this complex character full of contradictions. Watch how he shifts from cynical businessman to passionate lover to noble hero, sometimes all in the same scene. His performance was so nuanced that it completely changed how leading men could act in Hollywood. Paul Henreid as Victor Laszlo had possibly the toughest job in the movie. He had to make a genuinely good guy interesting enough that audiences would believe Ilsa might choose him over Rick. The way he carries himself throughout the film, dignified but human, makes the ending actually work. Then there's Claude Rains as Captain Renault. This guy steals every scene he's in with perfect timing. That line about being shocked to find that gambling is going on in here while pocketing his winnings, pure gold. Rains made corruption look charming, which isn't easy to pull off. Dooley Wilson, who played Sam, couldn't actually play the piano. He was a drummer. All his piano scenes were mimed to recordings made by a real pianist. But his rendition of As Time Goes By is so genuine and heartfelt that nobody cared about the technical stuff. Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre bring their A-game to even tiny scenes. Watch their one scene together. It's like a masterclass in character acting. These guys could communicate volumes with just a look or a gesture. The supporting cast was incredible because they were basically playing themselves. Most of them were European refugees who'd fled the Nazis. Peter Lorre, who plays Ugarte, had escaped from Nazi Germany. Conrad Veidt, who plays the Nazi Major Strasser, was actually a German actor who'd fled Germany because he was anti-Nazi. He often played Nazis in Hollywood because he wanted to make them look as evil as possible. And those famous scenes? Like when the German officers start singing Die Wacht am Rhein and Victor Laszlo leads everyone in singing La Marseillaise? Many of the extras were crying real tears because they were actual refugees who'd lived through Nazi occupation. That's not acting. That's real emotion right there. The chemistry between Bogart and Bergman feels so natural. But here's the kicker. They hardly spoke to each other off camera. Their magic was purely professional, which makes it even more impressive. And that famous last scene at the airport? They shot it in a studio, and Bergman was wearing a box to stand on because she was actually taller than Bogart. In the end, this unlikely group of actors, American tough guy, Swedish beauty, British character actor, and real European refugees, came together to create something unforgettable. They weren't just acting out a love story, they were telling the story of a world in crisis, and many of them had lived it themselves. Here's something most people don't know. Casablanca actually has a few different versions floating around. The original cut was a bit longer, with some extra scenes between Rick and Ilsa that got trimmed for pacing. But unlike a lot of classic films, there wasn't some drastically different version locked away in a vault. What you see today is pretty much what audiences saw in 1942. The way people watched Casablanca changed completely over time. When it first came out, people saw it as a topical war movie. Good entertainment, but nothing special. Then something interesting happened. As the years went by, people started noticing all these layers they'd missed before. The political stuff, the moral choices, the way it dealt with sacrifice and duty. It all started hitting different. Critics who originally gave it lukewarm reviews started changing their tune. By the 1950s, the film was already being called a classic. The French film critics, who were super picky, absolutely loved it. They saw all these deeper themes about moral choices and personal sacrifice that American critics had kind of glossed over. Want some fun trivia? The famous line, "Play it again, Sam," is never actually said in the movie. Ingrid Bergman says, "Play it, Sam," and Bogart says, "You played it for her, you can play it for me." But nobody ever says the complete phrase that everyone quotes. The movie's got tons of little details you might miss on first viewing, like how Rick never drinks with his customers except twice, both times with Ilsa, or how Captain Renault always wears his medal on the wrong side, showing his disrespect for authority. Even the name, Rick's Café Américain, is a subtle dig at French colonial rule. There's also this weird urban legend that Ronald Reagan and Ann Sheridan filmed the lead roles in an alternate version. Complete nonsense. But the story stuck around for years because Reagan was actually considered for the part early on. The film's reputation just kept growing. By the 1970s, film schools were teaching it as a perfect example of Hollywood storytelling. Critics started ranking it among the greatest films ever made. The American Film Institute put it at number 3 on their list of greatest American movies, right behind Citizen Kane and The Godfather. What's really interesting is how different generations find different things to love about it. In the 40s, it was about the war. In the 60s, people connected with its cynicism to idealism arc. Today, folks are drawn to its themes about refugees and moral choices in difficult times. The movie somehow manages to feel relevant no matter when you watch it. Fascinated by these legendary performances? Hit subscribe to discover more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age. Up next, we'll explore how Casablanca evolved from a simple wartime drama into one of cinema's greatest treasures. So, what makes Casablanca still matter after all these years? Well, it's basically become the blueprint for how to make a perfect movie. Every romantic drama since has borrowed something from it. That cynical hero who finds his conscience? That's Rick's DNA right there. The idea of sacrificing love for a greater good. Pure Casablanca. Think about Star Wars. That cantina scene is basically Rick's cafe in space. The love triangle in The English Patient? That's Casablanca in the desert. Even modern TV shows like The Americans have borrowed its themes about love versus duty. The whole getting back with your ex while Nazis are around thing has become its own mini-genre. Hollywood's still trying to capture that Casablanca magic. They've attempted remakes and sequels. There was even a colorized version in the 1980s that everybody hated. But nothing comes close to the original. It's like lightning in a bottle. The film's influence goes way beyond movies. Here's Looking at You, Kid is something people say even if they've never seen the film. Round up the usual suspects. We'll always have Paris. This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. These lines have become part of our everyday language. What's really amazing is how modern the movie feels. A story about refugees trying to escape persecution, about people choosing between love and doing the right thing, about standing up to fascism. Yeah, that stuff's still pretty relevant. The technical stuff we talked about earlier, those camera angles, the lighting, the way they handled close-ups, that's still influencing directors today. Christopher Nolan has talked about how Casablanca inspired his approach to emotional scenes. The Coen brothers reference it all the time. But maybe the biggest legacy of Casablanca is that it proves perfect movies can happen by accident. Nobody involved thought they were making a masterpiece. They were just trying to make a good movie with the resources they had. And somehow, all those limitations, all those problems, all that uncertainty, it all came together to create something timeless. Looking at it today, Casablanca reminds us why we love movies in the first place. It's got romance, action, humor, politics, morality, but most importantly, it's got heart. In a world of franchises and focus groups, it shows that sometimes the best stories are the ones that just happen naturally. As Rick would say, here's looking at you, kid. And we're still looking, decades later, still finding new things to love about this accidental masterpiece. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of cinema's greatest treasures, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are plenty more classic film stories waiting to be told, from behind-the-scenes secrets to groundbreaking innovations that shape the movies we love today. Drop a comment below with your favorite Casablanca moment, or share which classic film you'd like me to explore next. And remember, as Rick would say, this could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Until next time, here's looking at you, kid.